There's a moment in history, hidden beneath the grand narratives of kings and empires, where the quiet rumble of defiance changes everything. Picture this: a slave in ancient Rome, a peasant in medieval Europe, or a craftsman in an oppressed city, each one standing up against forces far greater than themselves. These aren't just footnotes in textbooks. They're the sparks that lit fires of change, the voices that refused to be silenced. And their stories, they're more than just tales of rebellion. They're blueprints of courage, lessons in what happens when ordinary people dare to demand the extraordinary. Think about the last time you felt injustice weigh on you, that simmering frustration when power seems untouchable. Now, multiply that by centuries, from Spartacus leading an army of slaves against Rome's might to the defiant uprisings of medieval peasants who'd had enough of tyranny. History is threaded with these explosive moments where the underdog said, "No more." But here's the thing, these rebellions weren't just about violence or chaos. They were about hope, a hope so fierce it could topple kingdoms, reshape societies, and echo across generations. And that's why these stories still matter, because they remind us that change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when people unite. So today, we're stepping into the shadows of history to uncover these lost chapters of resistance. We'll walk the battlefields where the oppressed became the unstoppable, decode the strategies of rebels who outsmarted empires, and ask the burning question: what does it take to stand up when the world tells you to kneel? This isn't just a journey through time, it's a testament to the unyielding human spirit. By the end, you won't just know these stories, you'll feel them. Because the fight for justice never really ends, it just finds new voices, ready to meet them. Let's begin. Resistance in the ancient world wasn't always about grand battles or dramatic showdowns. Sometimes it was as quiet as a whispered song or as subtle as a broken tool. Imagine a slave in Rome accidentally dropping an amphora of precious wine, or a peasant in Egypt hiding a portion of their grain from tax collectors. These small acts were rebellion, a way to chip away at the foundations of oppression without ever lifting a sword. But what truly defined ancient resistance? It was any action, large or small, that refused to accept the status quo. From the enslaved workers who slowed their labor to the scribes who encoded protest in their writings, defiance wore many faces. Take the story of the survey Roman slaves who escaped their masters and formed hidden communities in the mountains. They didn't have armies or weapons, but their very existence was a challenge to Rome's power. Or consider the Bagadi, peasant rebels in late Roman Gaul who turned their plows into spears, not just to fight but to reclaim their autonomy. Even in cultures where open revolt was impossible, resistance thrived in other ways. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple workers sometimes staged silent strikes, refusing to perform rituals until their grievances were heard. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were calculated, collective efforts to demand fairness in systems designed to crush them. And then there were the cultural rebellions, the ones that fought not with force but with identity. When the Persians conquered Babylon, the locals clung to their language and gods, quietly undermining their rulers' attempts to erase them. In ancient Judea, Jewish communities risked everything to preserve their traditions under foreign rule. These weren't battles waged on fields but in hearts and minds, proving that resistance could be as powerful as any army. What tied all these acts together? The unshakable belief that no one, not kings, not empires, had the right to strip people of their dignity. Whether through revolt, evasion, or sheer stubbornness, ancient resistance was humanity's first draft of justice. And every time we uncover these stories, we're reminded, The fight for freedom is as old as civilization itself. The name Spartacus still echoes through history, not just as a gladiator, but as a symbol of defiance that terrified an empire. Imagine the heat of the Italian summer in 73 BC, the air thick with the smell of sweat and iron inside a gladiator school in Capua. Here, enslaved men trained to kill for Roman entertainment until one night, when Spartacus and 70 others turned their kitchen utensils into weapons and broke free. This wasn't just an escape, it was the first spark of a rebellion that would swell into an army of 90,000, shaking Rome's foundations. What made Spartacus different wasn't just his skill in combat, but his vision. While other slave revolts had flared up before, none united such a diverse force: Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and even local Italian herdsmen, all bound by shared oppression. They didn't just hide in the hills, they outmaneuvered Roman legions for 2 years, using the terrain of Mount Vesuvius to their advantage. At one point, Spartacus' forces humiliated the elite Roman army by forcing defeated soldiers to fight as gladiators in funeral games for fallen rebels, a poetic reversal of their own suffering. Yet the most haunting part of Spartacus' story isn't the battles, it's the choices. When his army reached the Alps and could have fled Rome's grasp forever, they turned back. Some historians believe it was a bid to liberate more slaves. Others say internal divisions led them south. Either way, that decision sealed their fate. The final confrontation in 71 BC saw 6,000 crucified rebels lining the Appian Way, a brutal warning from Rome, but the empire's show of strength betrayed its fear. Why else would they go to such lengths to erase a man who, by some accounts, never even wanted to overthrow Rome just to be free? Spartacus' legacy isn't just in the bloodshed. It's in the way his rebellion exposed the fragility of power. Rome pretended slaves were beneath notice until they became an existential threat, and while the revolt failed, it planted a seed. Future uprisings, from the Haitian Revolution to labor movements, would draw strength from his example, because Spartacus proved something timeless: no chain is unbreakable when enough hands pull at it. His story asks us what freedom is worth and how far we'd go to claim it. Spartacus may be the most famous, but he was far from alone in the ancient world's struggle against slavery. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, enslaved people rose up again and again, proving that even the most brutal systems could be challenged. Take Sicily in the 2nd century BC, where 2 massive revolts known as the Sicilian Slave Wars erupted within 30 years. The first began with a simple act of defiance. A slave named Eunice, who claimed prophetic visions, led a band of rebels to seize the city of Enna. What started as a few hundred soon swelled to tens of thousands, with former herdsmen and farm workers outmaneuvering Roman forces for years. They minted their own coins, crowned Eunice as king, and for a brief moment carved out a space where the enslaved ruled themselves. Then there was the Zanj Rebellion, a lesser-known but equally astonishing uprising in 9th century Mesopotamia. Thousands of enslaved East Africans, forced to labor in the brutal salt marshes near Basra, turned the tools of their oppression, hoes and sickles, into weapons. For 14 years, they held their ground against the Abbasid Caliphate, one of the most powerful empires of the time. They built fortresses, formed alliances with local tribes, and even established their own capital. The Zanj weren't just fighting for freedom, they were building a new society in the shadow of their oppressors. But why did these rebellions keep happening, despite the near certainty of brutal retaliation? Because slavery wasn't just labor, it was a complete denial of humanity. In Rome, slaves could be tortured for testimony, crucified for minor offenses, or fed to beasts for entertainment. In such a world, rebellion wasn't just a gamble for freedom, it was a reclaiming of dignity. Even when revolts failed, they forced empires to expend vast resources, revealing how dependent they were on enslaved labor. After the Second Sicilian Slave War, Rome tightened control over slave markets and increased punishments, proof that these uprisings had struck a nerve. What's remarkable is how these rebellions echoed across time. The tactics used escaping to remote areas, forming alliances with other oppressed groups, striking where the system was weakest, would reappear in later revolts, from the Haitian Revolution to the Underground Railroad. And while ancient slave rebellions rarely achieved lasting victory, they planted an idea that no hierarchy is unshakable. Every time a group of enslaved people rose up, they proved that the master's power wasn't absolute. They showed that chains could be broken, even if it took generations. And perhaps most importantly, they left a blueprint, not just for how to resist, but for why resistance matters. Because in the end, oppression thrives on silence, and these rebels, they refused to stay quiet. Feudalism wasn't just a system, it was a cage. For generations, medieval peasants worked the land under backbreaking conditions, giving up most of what they grew to lords who lived in luxury. But there came moments when the weight of injustice grew too heavy, when the poor decided they'd rather die fighting than starve silently. The year 1381 in England was one of those moments. A young radical named Wat Tyler and a fiery preacher named John Ball ignited a firestorm of rebellion that swept across the countryside. This wasn't just a chaotic mob, it was a movement with demands: an end to serfdom, fair wages, and the right to negotiate freely. The rebels marched on London, burning tax records and storming the Tower itself. For a few dizzying days, it seemed like the entire feudal order might crumble. King Richard II, just 14 years old, faced them directly at Mile End, promising reforms, but the promises were hollow. Once the rebellion lost momentum, the retaliation was brutal. Wat Tyler was murdered during negotiations, John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and the revolt was crushed. Yet something had shifted. The English ruling class could no longer pretend their power was untouchable. Across the Channel, France had its own explosion of rage, the Jacquerie of 1358. Here, peasants rose up not just against their lords, but against the very knights who were supposed to protect them. The nobility had failed miserably during the 100 Years' War, leaving villages vulnerable to marauding armies and famine. When the peasants finally snapped, their fury was terrifying. Castles burned, noble families were slaughtered, and for a few weeks the social order flipped upside down. Like the English Revolt, it ended in bloody suppression. But the message was clear: oppression had limits. What's striking about these rebellions isn't just their violence, but their sophistication. The English rebels targeted symbols of oppression: tax collectors, corrupt officials, not random civilians. They drafted petitions, organized marches, and even negotiated with the crown. This wasn't mindless rage, it was politics by other means, and while the immediate gains were few, the long-term impact was undeniable. Lords grew wary of pushing peasants too far. Tax policies were softened. The myth of peasant passivity was shattered forever. These uprisings remind us that desperation isn't the same as helplessness. When medieval peasants rose up, they weren't just lashing out, they were rewriting the rules. Their rebellions forced the powerful to ask a question that still echoes today: how much injustice will people tolerate before they fight back? The answer, then as now, is simple: only so much, because history shows us again and again when the poor say, "No more," the world listens. Faith has always been more than just a personal belief, it's a force that can topple empires. When the Maccabees rose up against the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BC, They weren't just fighting for land or power, they were battling to preserve their very identity. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV had outlawed Jewish practices, desecrated the temple, and demanded worship of Greek gods. For many, this wasn't just oppression, it was spiritual annihilation. But one priestly family, the Maccabees, turned their faith into a weapon. With guerrilla tactics and unshakable conviction, they rallied villagers and outcasts, retaking Jerusalem and rededicating the temple in an event still celebrated as Hanukkah. What made their revolt extraordinary wasn't just its success, but how it fused faith with resistance. The Maccabees didn't just want to win battles, they wanted to reclaim their right to worship. Their struggle became a template for later movements, proving that religion could unify people across class and region. Fast forward to 19th century China, and you'll see the same explosive mix in the Taiping Rebellion. Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar who believed he was Christ's younger brother, inspired millions to rise against the Qing dynasty. His vision blended Christianity with radical social reforms, land redistribution, gender equality, the abolition of private property, creating a movement so vast it became one of history's bloodiest civil wars. These rebellions reveal a pattern. When faith is threatened, it doesn't just inspire quiet prayer, it fuels revolution. In both cases, religion provided something empires couldn't easily crush: moral clarity. Oppressors could seize land or impose taxes, but they couldn't erase the belief that their rule was unjust in the eyes of the divine. That's why these movements often outlasted their leaders. Even when the Maccabees dynasty eventually fell to Rome, their story lived on as a symbol of resilience. The Taiping Rebellion may have ended in tragedy, but it exposed the Qing dynasty's fragility, hastening its decline. Yet there's a darker side to faith-driven revolts. The same fervor that unites can also divide. The Maccabees, once rebels, became rulers who imposed their own strict religious laws. The Taiping leadership grew increasingly paranoid, turning on its own followers. This tension between liberation and dogma echoes through history. What begins as a fight for spiritual freedom can harden into new forms of control. Still, the legacy of these uprisings endures. They remind us that the most potent rebellions aren't just about changing who rules, but why. When people believe their cause is sacred, they'll walk into battle with nothing but stones, and sometimes against all odds they'll win. Because faith, at its core, is the belief that the impossible is possible, and in the hands of the oppressed, that's the most dangerous idea of all. History books love their warrior kings and revolutionary generals, but behind every great rebellion, there were women shaping the fight, often erased from the record. Take Boudica, the flame-haired queen of the Iceni, who turned grief into an uprising that nearly broke Rome's grip on Britain. After Roman soldiers flogged her and assaulted her daughters, she didn't just mourn. She rallied an army of 100,000, burning Londinium to the ground. For a fleeting moment, she made the empire tremble. But here's what most accounts skip. Boudica wasn't some lone fury. She was part of a tradition of women who weaponized their visibility in societies that tried to render them invisible. Across the world in 1st century Vietnam, the Trưng Sisters proved rebellion could wear a woman's face. When Chinese invaders executed Trưng Tletawanief's husband, she and her sister Trưng Nhtletawaniecb didn't retreat into widowhood. They raised an army, mostly women, and liberated 65 fortresses in a single year. Their secret: they understood something empires often forget: oppression fuels unity. Peasants, aristocrats, even former enemies joined their ranks, all inspired by sisters who refused to accept defeat. Even after their eventual capture, their legend grew. Today, they're national heroes, proof that resistance doesn't need a beard or a broadsword to change history. Then there's the quiet rebellion of the Oracle of Delphi. While not a warrior, her influence shaped wars. When Spartan kings sought advice before battle, her prophecies, often delivered by priestesses, could sway entire campaigns. In a world where women were barred from politics, these sacred voices became backdoor power brokers. And let's not forget the Adivasi women of ancient India, who led forest-dwelling tribes against invading Mauryan forces. Their knowledge of the land turned trees into fortresses and vines into weapons, outsmarting armies 10 times their size. Why does this matter? Because for centuries, historians framed rebellion as men's work, swords and spears and chest-thumping valor. But women's resistance was often subtler, smarter. They used their prescribed roles as mothers, priestesses, and healers to hide rebels, pass messages, or poison tyrants' wine. When they did take up arms, like the Berber Queen Dihia who crushed Arab invaders in 7th century North Africa, their victories were dismissed as miracles or luck. But dig deeper and you'll find a pattern. Women didn't just join rebellions, they redefined them. They fought not only for land or power, but for the right to tell their own stories. And in the end, that might be the most revolutionary act of all. The Mapuch people didn't just resist colonization, they defied it for over 300 years, outlasting empires that thought conquest was inevitable. In the rugged terrain of southern Chile and Argentina, they turned the land itself into a weapon. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, expecting quick submission, the Mapuch fought back with tactics that would make modern guerrillas nod in respect. They mastered ambushes in dense forests, used stolen horses to outmaneuver cavalry, and even adapted European weapons for their own defense. But their greatest strength wasn't steel or strategy, it was unity. While other indigenous groups fractured under pressure, the Mapuch formed alliances across clans, creating a resistance so cohesive that Spain eventually signed treaties recognizing their autonomy. That's right, a European empire forced to negotiate with people it had labeled savages. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Arawak peoples faced a different kind of onslaught. Columbus's arrival in 1492 didn't just bring ships, it unleashed waves of violence, disease, and enslavement. Yet the Arawak didn't vanish quietly. Some fled to remote islands, preserving their culture in hidden communities. Others, like the Taino leader Enriquillo, waged relentless guerrilla campaigns from mountain strongholds. His rebellion in the 1520s dragged on for 14 years, so costly to the Spanish that they finally granted him land and freedom for his people. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were calculated acts of survival, proving that even against overwhelming force, resistance could carve out spaces of dignity. What set indigenous resistance apart wasn't just the battles, it was the refusal to let their world be erased. The Mapuch didn't just fight Spaniards, they rejected their gods, their laws, even their animals. When missionaries brought European crops, Mapuch farmers kept planting native maize. When colonizers demanded tribute, they burned their own harvests rather than hand them over. This wasn't stubbornness, it was a declaration that some things couldn't be bought or conquered. The Arawak, too, clung to their traditions in secret, passing down languages and rituals through generations, ensuring that even in defeat, their identity endured. Today, these struggles are often framed as tragedies, noble but doomed. That's a myth. Indigenous resistance reshaped empires. Spain's failure to subdue the Mapuch forced it to divert resources and men, weakening its grip elsewhere. The Arawak rebellions exposed the brutality of the encomienda system, sparking debates in Europe about colonial abuse. These weren't footnotes, they were turning points. And the lessons, they're alive in modern movements, from Standing Rock to the Amazon. where land defenders still draw on ancient strategies of unity, adaptability, and unyielding cultural pride. Because the fight was never just about territory, it was about proving that some fires once lit can't be extinguished. Some rebellions didn't need armies, just a knife in the dark and a vow of silence. In the mountains of Persia, between the 11th and 13th centuries, the assassins perfected the art of invisible defiance. They weren't just killers, they were strategic disruptors, picking off generals, viziers, and even sultans with chilling precision. Their power didn't come from numbers, but from the terror of the unseen. A ruler might wake to find a dagger pinned to his pillow with a note, "No attack, just a promise." That psychological warfare was their real weapon, and it worked. At their peak, they forced empires to negotiate with a handful of men hidden in remote fortresses, proving that fear could bend even the mightiest thrones. Half a world away in India, the Thuggee cult waged a different kind of shadow war. Posing as travelers, they lured victims into trust before striking not for wealth, but as ritual offerings to the goddess Kali. British colonizers later exaggerated their brutality to justify crackdowns, but the truth was more nuanced. The Thuggee weren't mindless killers. They were a secret society bound by oaths and signs, thriving in the gaps of a fractured land. Like the assassins, they exposed an uncomfortable truth. When power is too centralized to challenge openly, resistance slithers underground. What linked these groups wasn't violence, but their mastery of secrecy. The assassins used coded poetry and intricate hand gestures to communicate under the noses of their enemies. The Thuggee developed a language of knots and handkerchiefs to mark targets. These weren't just tactics, they were survival. In societies where speaking out meant death, silence became a shield. Even their reputations were weapons. The assassins let rumors of drug-induced fanaticism spread, knowing their mystique would paralyze foes. The Thuggee's mythos grew so potent that British troops would panic at the sight of a loose scarf. Yet their legacies are tangled. The assassins were eventually crushed by Mongol invasions, but their name became shorthand for covert terror. The Thuggee were hunted to near extinction, their story twisted into colonial propaganda. But dig deeper and you'll find something more profound. These groups didn't just resist power, they revealed its paranoia. Every ruler who slept behind extra guards, every road patrol doubled because of whispers, proved that invisible defiance could drain an empire's strength without a single battle. And that's the unsettling lesson they leave us. When dissent is forced underground, it doesn't disappear, it mutates. The assassins and Thuggee were extreme examples, but they show how oppression breeds ingenuity. From the coded quilts of the Underground Railroad to the samizdat literature of Soviet dissidents, history's quiet rebels keep teaching the same truth. Sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't the shouts in the streets, but the secrets passed in the dark. Rebellions weren't just fought with swords, they were won with words. Long before hashtags and viral posts, ancient dissidents mastered the art of propaganda, turning whispers into weapons. Take Rome's Gracchi brothers in the 2nd century BC. These aristocratic reformers didn't raise armies, they raised their voices, delivering fiery speeches that laid bare the greed of the elite. Tiberius Gracchus stood before crowds, holding handfuls of soil and demanding, "Why should the poor fight for lands they'll never own?" His words electrified the plebeians, not because they were new, but because they named the injustice everyone felt but no one dared say. When the Senate murdered him for it, his brother Gaius took up the cause, circulating pamphlets that exposed corruption in the courts. Their legacy wasn't just in the land reforms they pushed through. It was in proving that rhetoric could be as dangerous as rebellion itself. Across the world in Han Dynasty China, rebels weaponized prophecy. The Yellow Turban Uprising in the 2nd century, a deed didn't start with a battle cry, but with a mystic chant. "The sky is dead, the yellow sky will rise." Their leader, Zhang Jiao, blended Taoist philosophy with apocalyptic vision, promising followers that illness and famine weren't just misfortunes, they were signs of a dynasty's divine expiration date. Peasants who'd never held a sword memorized his verses, singing them in fields and marketplaces until the message spread like wildfire. The government could arrest rebels, but how do you arrest an idea? Even Spartacus understood this. Before he ever led a charge, he leveraged the power of spectacle. When his gladiator army defeated Roman forces, he didn't just bury the dead. He staged a mock funeral with captured soldiers forced to fight as gladiators. The symbolism was brutal and brilliant. Rome's own entertainment turned against it. This wasn't just revenge, it was theater designed to break the myth of Roman invincibility. The most ingenious propaganda, though, often came from the oppressed themselves. Enslaved Africans in the Americas sang coded spirituals about crossing the Jordan, mapping escape routes into lyrics. Medieval peasants hid anti-nobility satire in bawdy festival plays, laughing their rulers into ridicule. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were psychological warfare, chipping away at the stories that kept power in place. Because every hierarchy depends on one unspoken rule, that the oppressed believe in their own inferiority. The moment that illusion cracks, empires tremble. So the next time you hear a protest song or see graffiti on a wall, remember, this tradition is ancient. From the graffiti scrawled on Pompeii's walls mocking corrupt politicians to the Samizdat literature smuggled under oppressive regimes, rebellion has always begun not with a sword but with a story. And those stories, they're the kindling that lights the fires of change. Failure isn't always the end sometimes, it's the spark that lingers in the ashes. Take the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century, a rebellion so devastating that Rome didn't just crush it, they tried to erase Judea from the map. After 3 years of brutal fighting, the Emperor Hadrian renamed the province Syria Palestina, banned Jewish rituals, and scattered survivors across the empire. On the surface, it was total defeat, but underground, something survived. The rabbis who escaped rebuilt Judaism around study and prayer, laying the groundwork for the faith's survival outside its homeland. What Rome meant to destroy, it accidentally reinvented, a diaspora that would carry Jewish identity across centuries and continents. Then there's the Third Servile War, Spartacus Rebellion. Its bloody end didn't just kill rebels, it killed the idea of rebellion for generations. 6,000 crosses lining the Appian Way weren't just punishment, they were propaganda. Rome wanted every slave who walked that road to feel the weight of defiance in their bones, and it worked. Large-scale slave revolts vanished for centuries, not because oppression lessened, but because fear had been weaponized. Yet even here, the story twists. Those crucified bodies became silent teachers. Future abolitionists would point to Spartacus as proof that no one is born a slave, they're made one. His defeat became a rallying cry he never lived to hear. Some failures, though, backfire on the oppressors. When the German peasants' revolt of 1525 collapsed, the nobility celebrated until Martin Luther, whose words had inspired the Uprising, turned on the rebels in horror. His condemnation shattered the unity of the Protestant Reformation, splitting it into factions that would fight each other as fiercely as they fought Rome. The peasants lost the battle, but the lords lost something subtler, the illusion of divine right. Their violent crackdown exposed the hypocrisy of Christian rulers who preached mercy while ordering massacres. Future revolutions, from the French to the Russian, would quote the peasants' demands verbatim, proving that ideas outlive the hands that write them. What binds these stories isn't just tragedy, it's transformation. The Haitian Revolution's first uprising in 1791 ended in failure, with leader Dutty Boukman killed and his followers hunted. But the revolt's mere existence terrified slaveholders across the Americas, fueling paranoia that hastened abolition. Similarly, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943 couldn't stop the Holocaust, but it rewrote the narrative of Jewish passivity, inspiring later resistance from Israel to the civil rights movement. These rebellions teach us that history isn't a ledger of wins and losses. It's a current where even drowned voices ripple outward. Every failed revolt forced the powerful to spend resources, reveal their cruelty, and expose their fears. And every time they overreacted, burning books, banning traditions, filling roads with crosses, they handed their enemies the one thing oppression can't tolerate: a story. Because while empires can crush rebellions, they can't crush the fact that they happened. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Hunger has a way of sharpening desperation into defiance. In ancient Rome, where bread wasn't just food but the glue holding society together, a sudden spike in grain prices could ignite chaos. The bread riots of the 1st century weren't random outbursts. They were calculated explosions of rage against a system rigged for the elite. Emperors knew this. That's why they staged lavish grain distributions, not out of generosity but fear. Because when the poor couldn't feed their children, even the Colosseum's distractions couldn't stop them from storming bakeries or burning tax collectors' homes. These weren't just food riots, they were the earliest strikes against economic tyranny, proving that an empty stomach has no patience for empty promises. But bread was only part of the story. Across the ancient world, salt, a commodity as vital as gold, became another flashpoint. In France, centuries later, the Gabelle salt tax would push peasants to the brink, but the pattern started much earlier. In China's Han Dynasty, salt monopolies let emperors bleed dry entire regions, sparking rebellions that fused economic fury with political revolt. What made these taxes so explosive wasn't just their weight, but their arrogance. Rulers didn't just take a share of what people grew, they claimed ownership of the very earth and sea, taxing the salt in fishermen's nets or the sweat on miners' brows. When survival itself became taxable, rebellion wasn't just inevitable, it was survival. Yet the deepest wound wasn't poverty, but the chasm between rich and poor. In Ptolemaic Egypt, a peasant's petition from the 3rd century BC survives, scrawled on papyrus. The tax collector came not for grain, but for my daughter. Behind those words lay a system where debt turned children into collateral, where landlords hoarded harvests while families starved. No wonder uprisings like the Boudica Revolt erupted, with farmers turning swamps into fortresses and sickles into swords. Their demands weren't just for lower taxes, but for something radical: the idea that no one should profit from another's hunger. Fast forward to today, and the echoes are uncanny. From the French Yellow Vests protesting fuel taxes to modern movements against corporate greed, economic injustice still wears the same ancient face. The details change, replacing salt tariffs with student loans or grain hoarders with hedge funds, but the core truth remains: when the scales tip too far, they don't just wobble. They shatter. History's lesson: oppression thrives on measured doses. Push too hard, and even the meekest will remind you they built the very system you're breaking. The greatest trick conquerors ever pulled was convincing the world their culture was unstoppable, because beneath the surface, the old ways never died. They just went underground. When Rome swallowed Gaul, they expected the Celtic tribes to vanish into the empire's fabric. Instead, the Druids did something ingenious. They turned memory into a weapon. Forbidden to write their sacred knowledge, they encoded it in knotwork patterns on everyday objects: a basket's weave, a cloak's embroidery. To Roman eyes, it was decoration. To the initiated, it was an entire cosmology preserved in plain sight. This wasn't just art, it was resistance by needle and thread. Jewish communities perfected this art of invisible endurance. After the temple's destruction in 70 AD, rabbis faced an existential question. How do you practice a faith centered on a place that no longer exists? Their answer: you rebuild it in words. The Talmud wasn't just a religious text, it was a portable homeland, a way to carry Jerusalem in the rhythm of daily life. Even under persecution, Jewish families lit Sabbath candles in hidden cellars, their flames defying the darkness of exile. When Spanish inquisitors hunted conversos for secretly practicing Judaism, those families baked Hanukkah oil into their holiday sweets, turning desserts into declarations. But cultural resistance wasn't always about hiding. Sometimes it was about outlasting. In the Andes, Quechua communities under Spanish rule performed Catholic masses, but whispered prayers to Pachamama, the earth goddess, between the Latin verses. Their churches, built on the foundations of Inca temples, their walls literally holding the bones of the old gods. The colonizers saw conversion. The locals knew it was camouflage. What makes these acts so powerful is their quiet audacity. A language band becomes a lullaby sung at bedtime. A ritual outlawed transforms into a children's game. The Roman poet Ovid mocked the Geti tribes for babbling in their savage tongue, not realizing that same tongue would birth modern Romanian, a language that outlived Rome itself. Oppressors never seem to grasp that culture isn't just monuments and manuscripts. It's the way a grandmother knots a scarf, the proverbs muttered over a plow, the spices smuggled in a migrant's pouch. And that's why cultural resistance terrifies empires more than armies. You can crush a rebellion in a season, but how do you kill a story that's been whispered for generations? The answer: you can't. Because while conquerors are busy rewriting history, the oppressed are busy remembering it, one stitch, one recipe, one bedtime story at a time. Stories have always been the secret keepers of rebellion, whispering truths too dangerous to say aloud. Take Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from Olympus, not just a myth about light, but a blueprint for defiance. Every culture has its version. Loki's cunning in Norse tales, Anansi the spider weaving mischief in West African folklore, or Coyote outsmarting the gods in Native American legends. These tricksters weren't just entertainers, they were subversives, proving that even the powerless could outwit tyrants with wit and will. And here's the thing, these stories weren't escapism. They were survival manuals disguised as bedtime tales, teaching listeners how to bend rules without breaking themselves. Consider Aesop's fables, where enslaved people and animals spoke in code. A fox praising sour grapes wasn't just about envy. It was a lesson in saving face when freedom was out of reach. The Biara rabbit stories, born from African-American oral tradition, turned a clever rabbit's escapes into metaphors for resisting slavery. Even the biblical tale of David and Goliath, with its underdog triumph, became a rallying cry for rebels from medieval peasants to modern protest movements. The message was clear: giants can fall, but literature didn't just reflect rebellion, it fueled it. During the Enlightenment, Voltaire's satires weren't just read, they were smuggled, their mockery of kings eroding divine right like acid on iron. In 19th century Russia, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and Tolstoy's essays didn't just critique society, they radicalized a generation. And let's not forget the pamphlets of the American Revolution, where Thomas Paine's Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies in 3 months, turning colonists into revolutionaries with nothing but ink and paper. Today, the tradition thrives. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale isn't just dystopian fiction, it's a handbook for recognizing authoritarianism. The Hunger Games' three-fingered salute jumped from pages to real-world protests in Thailand and Myanmar. Even superhero comics, with their masked vigilantes, Tap into that ancient itch to fight back when systems fail. Because here's the truth, every revolution begins as a story. Someone imagines a world where the chains break, where the mouse outthinks the cat, where fire isn't a gift but a right, and once that story takes root, it becomes a weapon no empire can confiscate. So the next time you hear an old myth or lose yourself in a novel, listen closer. Between the lines, you might just hear the echo of a rebel's whisper, the one that says, "Another world is possible." And that's why tyrants burn books. They know better than anyone. Stories don't just describe change, they ignite it. There's a moment when oppression stops being something you endure and becomes something you refuse, a shift so profound it rewires the human mind. Psychologists call it the intolerability threshold, the point where the fear of staying silent outweighs the terror of fighting back. Ancient rebels understood this instinctively. When Spartacus turned his kitchen knives into weapons, or when the peasants of medieval England marched on London, they weren't acting on blind rage. They'd done the math. The risk of death in battle became preferable to the slow death of submission. But what tips the scales? First, injustice must become visible. Take the Roman slave mines where workers died in darkness, their suffering hidden. Revolts rarely sparked there. Contrast that with the gladiator schools where enslaved warriors trained in plain sight, their strength on display for Rome's elite. When Spartacus rebelled, his fellow gladiators didn't just see their chains, they saw each other's power. Oppression thrives on isolation. Rebellion blooms in solidarity. Hope is the second ingredient. Not the vague kind, but the tactical hope that comes from seeing cracks in the system. The Zanj rebels in Mesopotamia didn't rise up because freedom seemed likely. They rose because the Abbasid Empire was distracted by war, creating an opening. Similarly, the Maccabees exploited the Seleucid dynasty's internal strife. Rebellions rarely ignite under absolute tyranny. They flare when oppressors show weakness, however slight. A single chink in the armor can inspire thousands to swing their hammers. Then there's identity, the unshakable belief that you deserve better. Studies of modern resistance movements find a striking pattern. People don't revolt when they're merely hungry or oppressed, but when they're humiliated. The medieval peasants who followed Wat Tyler weren't just starving. They'd been told their suffering was God's will. Their rebellion began the moment they rejected that lie. The same spark animated Boudica after Romans flogged her and assaulted her daughters. Injustice alone can be endured, dehumanization cannot. Yet rebellion isn't just rage, it's strategy. Ancient revolts often mirrored their oppressors' tactics. The Thracians who fought Rome borrowed its military formations. The Mapuch in Chile turned Spanish horses against conquistadors. Even in failure, rebels forced empires to adapt, proving that resistance reshapes both the oppressed and the oppressor. So why do people revolt? Because history whispers a secret. Chains are always weaker than they look. Every rebellion, from Spartacus to Soweto, started with someone realizing that truth. Not that they could win, but that they had to try. And in that trying, whether they lived or died, they changed what the world believed was possible. Because the greatest force in history isn't power, it's the refusal to accept that power is permanent. Leadership in ancient rebellions wasn't just about rallying a crowd, it was about turning fury into strategy. Take Spartacus, the gladiator who transformed a band of escaped slaves into an army that humiliated Rome. His genius wasn't in his sword arm, but in his ability to unite. Thracians, Celts, Germans, men who might have distrusted each other under normal circumstances, fought side by side because he gave them something bigger than their differences, a shared vision of freedom. But here's what's often overlooked. Spartacus wasn't just inspiring, he was pragmatic. When his forces reached the Alps, he didn't press on to mythical victories. He pivoted, adapting to the realities of supply lines and morale. That's what separated the legends from the lost, causes the willingness to balance fire with foresight. Boudica's leadership burned with a different flame. Where Spartacus wove alliances, she channeled collective grief into a single, scorching purpose. After Roman soldiers brutalized her and her daughters, she didn't just seek revenge. She weaponized the humiliation of every Briton under Rome's heel. Her power lay in her visibility. Riding a chariot with her fiery hair streaming, she embodied the rage her people had swallowed for years, but even her fury had method. She targeted symbols of Roman oppression, tax offices, wealthy estates, proving her rebellion wasn't mindless violence, but a calculated dismantling of colonial pride. Yet for every Spartacus or Boudica, there were leaders whose rebellions crumbled from within. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had charisma and tactical brilliance, uniting tribes against Caesar. But his fatal flaw, alienating the very allies he needed. When supplies ran low during the siege of Alesia, he expelled non-combatants from his stronghold, a move that backfired as starving women and children became a burden to his own forces. Contrast that with the Haitian Revolution's Toussaint Louverture, who decades later would turn former enemies into collaborators, proving that rebellion isn't just about defiance but diplomacy. So what made the difference? First, the ability to see beyond the immediate fight. Spartacus knew when to retreat. Boudica understood the propaganda value of burning Londinium. Second, emotional intelligence, the knack for making disparate followers feel heard. The Zanj rebellion's leader, Ali ibn Muhammad, didn't just command enslaved Africans. He learned their languages, honored their customs, and turned their spiritual beliefs into rallying cries. And third, adaptability. When Rome's legions adjusted their tactics, successful rebels adjusted faster. The Mapuch in South America didn't just resist Spanish cavalry. They stole their horses and mastered their tactics, turning the invaders' weapons against them. The lesson echoes through history. Rebellions don't fail because people lack courage. They fail when leaders mistake passion for strategy or vengeance for vision. The most dangerous rebels weren't the ones who shouted loudest. They were the ones who listened to their people's needs, to the land's rhythms, to the quiet cracks in their oppressors' armor. Because tyranny isn't toppled by strength alone. It's dismantled by those shrewd enough to wield hope like a scalpel, cutting precisely where it hurts the powerful most. Ancient rebels didn't just fight, they rewrote the rules of war. When facing empires with endless legions and gleaming armor, they turned their so-called weaknesses into weapons. Take the Lusitanian leader Viriathus, who tormented Rome for nearly a decade in the 2nd century BC. His forces, lightly armed shepherds and hunters, should have been crushed. Instead, they vanished into the Iberian mountains, striking supply lines and melting away before reinforcements arrived. Rome sent army after army, only to find empty valleys and ambushed patrols. Viriathus' secret: he didn't just use the terrain, he became it, turning every cliff and forest into an extension of his strategy. Guerrilla tactics weren't just about evasion, they were psychological warfare. The Jewish rebels at Masada didn't confront Rome's siege engines head-on. They let the invaders climb the mountain, only to find storehouses burned and defensive walls abandoned, a haunting message that even victory could feel like defeat. Centuries later, the Viet Minh would study these very insurgencies, recognizing what ancient rebels knew: against overwhelming force, time is your ally. The longer you stretch the conflict, the more an empire's patience and purse strings wear thin. But terrain wasn't the only equalizer. Ancient rebels mastered the art of turning their enemies' strengths against them. The Germanic chieftain Arminius, once a Roman ally, lured 3 legions into the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD. The dense trees neutralized Rome's famed formations, forcing soldiers into chaotic skirmishes where Germanic axes outmaneuvered short swords. By the battle's end, 20,000 Romans lay dead, and the empire's expansion halted at the Rhine. It was a lesson in asymmetry. Don't match your foe's tactics, redefine them. Some rebels weaponized culture itself. The Parthians, nomadic horsemen, feigned retreat to draw Roman pursuers into killing zones, then unleashed their infamous Parthian shot, arrows loosed backward at full gallop. To Rome, this was dishonorable. To the Parthians, it was pragmatism. Their hit-and-run tactics didn't just win battles, they shattered the myth of Roman invincibility, proving that tradition could be a rebel's sharpest blade. What unites these strategies isn't just cleverness, but a radical reimagining of power. The Mapuch in South America didn't have steel, so they forged weapons from hardened wood and volcanic glass. The Numidian cavalry under Jugurtha used their reputation as cowards to bait disciplined Roman troops into reckless charges. Time and again, rebels demonstrated that innovation isn't just about tools, it's about seeing the battlefield differently. Because in the end, the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or a spear. It's the willingness to fight on your own terms, even when the world says you've already lost. Every rebellion, even those drowned in blood, left scars on the societies that sought to crush them. When Rome finally defeated Spartacus in 71 BC, they didn't just crucify 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way, they quietly reformed the slave system that had fueled his uprising. Gladiator schools saw stricter oversight, some plantation owners eased working conditions, and the worst abuses of slave traders were curbed. None of this was mercy. It was cold calculation. The Senate had glimpsed how quickly enslaved hands could become fists, and they knew the price of ignoring that lesson. Centuries later, medieval Europe faced the same reckoning. After the English peasants' revolt of 1381, landlords didn't just hang rebels, they adjusted feudal demands. Serfdom didn't vanish overnight, but the harshest labor obligations softened, and wages for free laborers crept upward. Why? Because Wat Tyler's army had proven something terrifying to the nobility. Even illiterate peasants could organize, articulate grievances, and storm the Tower of London. Oppression, it turned out, had diminishing returns, but the most surprising reforms often came from rebellions that never even succeeded. The German Peasants' War of 1525 was a massacre, with over 100,000 dead and leaders like Thomas Müntzer executed. Yet within decades, many feudal burdens lightened. Why? Because local lords, spooked by the scale of the uprising, preemptively granted concessions to avoid another explosion. The rebellion failed, but fear of its repetition rewrote the rules. Even in distant empires, the pattern held. China's Tang dynasty survived the An Lushan rebellion in the 8th century, but never again trusted regional generals with unchecked power. The bureaucracy expanded, military oversight tightened, and the emperor's court grew more cautious about overtaxing peasants. These weren't voluntary changes, they were survival tactics, forced upon rulers who'd seen how quickly discontent could spiral into catastrophe. The lesson etched into history isn't just that rebellions change things, it's how they change them. Rarely through outright victory, but through the quiet, grudging adjustments of those in power. Every revolt, successful or not, forced the powerful to ask, how much can we take before they break? And often, the answer came too late after the revolt had already rewritten the equation. Because oppression isn't just a moral question, it's a practical one. Push people too far, and they'll remind you that systems built on their backs only stand as long as they choose to carry them. So when we look at the long arc of history, rebellions aren't just footnotes, they're turning points. They're the moments when the cost of injustice finally outweighed the cost of reform. And every time a ruler loosened a chain, however slightly, they proved something revolutionary. Even in defeat, those who resist never truly lose, because the threat of rebellion lingers long after the last sword is sheathed, whispering to every tyrant that their grip is never as firm as it seems. The tools of rebellion have evolved, but the heartbeat of resistance remains the same. Where ancient rebels carved messages into clay tablets or whispered plans in market squares, today's activists tap out tweets that circle the globe in seconds. The Roman libelli pamphlets nailed to city walls find their echo in hashtags trending worldwide. Yet beneath the flash of modern technology, the same currents flow. The outrage at injustice, the hunger for dignity, the refusal to be erased. Take the printing press, once as revolutionary as social media. When Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread across Europe in the 16th century, it wasn't just theology, it was a viral movement proving that ideas could outrun armies. Fast forward to Arab Spring protesters live-streaming their marches, or Hong Kong activists coordinating via encrypted apps. The platforms change, but the playbook doesn't. Ancient rebels exploited their oppressors' blind spots, Roman roads for messengers, feudal trade routes for smuggled texts. Today, it's firewalls and algorithms, yet the goal is identical: to slip the noose of censorship and let truth spread faster than lies. But here's where history throws us a curve. Ancient uprisings often burned bright and brief, isolated by geography. Spartacus couldn't call on Gaulish rebels for reinforcements. Boudica's fury was contained to Britain. Modern resistance, though, is borderless. When George Floyd's murder ignited global protests in 2020, the cry, "I can't breathe," resonated from Minneapolis to Nairobi, a chorus of solidarity unimaginable in antiquity. Globalization didn't just shrink the world, it wired every struggle together, turning local sparks into wildfires. Yet some things resist change. The Roman elite dismissed slave revolts as the rage of mindless brutes, just as modern autocrats paint protesters as paid agitators. The Jacquerie peasants were smeared as bloodthirsty mobs, mirroring how peaceful marches today get framed as riots. Oppressors still play the same cards: dehumanize, divide, distract. But rebels keep finding new ways to call their bluff. The hunger strikes of suffragettes would have made sense to Roman prisoners refusing food. The sit-ins of the civil rights movement had cousins in the silent strikes of Mesopotamian temple workers. Perhaps the deepest thread connecting past and present is this: rebellion isn't just about force, it's about narrative. The Gracchi brothers' weaponized speeches, anonymous leaks, documents. The Yellow Turban rebels chanted prophecies, TikTok activists stitched protest anthems. Every successful revolt, ancient or modern, understands that power isn't just held by swords or servers, it's held by stories. And when the oppressed rewrite those stories, empires tremble. So while drones replace javelins and encryption replaces coded scrolls, the essence remains. A Roman slave whispering plans by firelight and a teenager live-streaming police brutality are kin across millennia. Both bet everything on a single, unshakable truth: that no system is eternal and no chain is unbreakable. The tools evolve, the fire does not. Lessons from ancient resistance aren't locked in the past, they're alive in every protest chant, every act of defiance, every moment someone chooses dignity over silence. What made Spartacus' rebellion or the Mapuch's 3-century stand against empires so powerful wasn't just their fury, but their clarity. They understood something we often forget: oppression survives on illusion. The illusion that power is monolithic, that resistance is futile, that chains are unbreakable. ancient rebels shattered those myths by doing three things we can still learn from today. First, they organized not just as fighters but as communities. The Zanj rebellion didn't start with swords drawn. It began with whispers in marshes, with enslaved Africans sharing stories of home while their hands bled from labor. That's how movements grow, not from top-down commands, but from the quiet work of trust building, of making the invisible visible. Second, they mastered the art of persistence. The Mapuch didn't defeat Spain in a single battle. They outlasted it, adapting their tactics over generations. When Spanish cavalry dominated open fields, they retreated to forests. When forts were built, they starved them out. Their resilience teaches us that change isn't always a sprint. Sometimes it's a relay, where the baton passes from one weary hand to the next until the finish line cracks into view. But perhaps the most urgent lesson is moral clarity. Ancient rebels didn't just fight for land or loot. They fought for the irreducible idea that no one is born to kneel. When Boudica faced Rome's legions, she didn't rally her people with promises of wealth. She showed them the scars on her back and asked, "What else is left to lose?" That raw honesty cut through fear like nothing else. Today's movements echo that truth, from the civil rights marchers who linked arms knowing the hoses would come, to the climate activists chaining themselves to pipelines. The most potent rebellions are those that strip away pretense and name the stakes, your dignity or your safety, but never both. Yet history also warns us of rebellion's pitfalls. The German peasants' revolt collapsed partly because its leaders underestimated the power of division. When the nobility offered minor concessions, some rebels laid down their arms, fracturing the movement. Ancient revolts remind us that solidarity isn't a feeling, it's a discipline. It's why labor organizers today drill into members, "Don't cross the picket line, no matter the offer." Because every empire, every unjust system, survives by convincing a few that their suffering is unique, their grievances exceptional. Breaking that spell is the first victory. So what does ancient resistance whisper to us now? That the playbook isn't outdated, it's just waiting for new hands to wield it. When Hong Kong protesters used laser pointers to blind surveillance cameras, they weren't so different from Roman slaves extinguishing torches to confuse their pursuers. When farmers in India blockaded highways with tractors, they channeled the same spirit as medieval peasants burning tax records. The tools evolve, but the calculus remains. Find your oppressor's pressure point, then press, not just with rage, but with precision. Because the through line of history isn't just that people resist, it's that resistance, when focused and unrelenting, bends the arc of power every time. Hollywood loves a clean rebellion, heroic underdogs charging into battle, outnumbered but pure of heart, their victory inevitable by the third act. But history doesn't work in montages. Real ancient rebellions were tangled in moral gray areas, fueled as much by desperation as idealism, and more often ended in crushing defeat than triumph. Take Spartacus, immortalized as a freedom fighter leading a righteous crusade. The truth, his rebellion began with 70 gladiators stealing kitchen knives to escape bondage, not to overthrow Rome. Their ranks swelled not just with enslaved idealists, but with bandits, deserters, and opportunists. When they raided Roman villas, it wasn't always to liberate slaves, sometimes it was for food, gold, or revenge. That doesn't diminish their courage, but it complicates the myth, because real resistance isn't about perfect heroes, it's about flawed humans pushed past breaking points. Another myth, that rebellions were always grassroots uprisings. In reality, many were orchestrated by disillusioned elites. The Maccabees weren't starving peasants, they were a priestly family with land and influence, leveraging religious outrage to rally support. Even the legendary Boudica wasn't some commoner turned warrior queen. She was royalty, Her revolt sparked as much by personal humiliation as collective injustice. This doesn't make their causes less valid, but it reminds us that rebellion often wears many faces, some in rags, others in robes. Then there's the Hollywood trope of the glorious last stand. Films love to frame defeats as moral victories. Think 300 Spartans holding Thermopylae. But ancient rebellions rarely ended so neatly. The Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome didn't just fail, it erased Jewish presence in Judea for generations. Survivors weren't hailed as martyrs, they were sold into slavery or scattered to the winds. The Sicilian slave wars crushed with such brutality that crucifixion scaffolds dotted the countryside for miles. These weren't noble sacrifices, they were catastrophes. Yet within those ashes, something survived, the stories, the refusal to forget. That's where the real victory often lay, not in battles won, but in truths that refused to die. Perhaps the most dangerous myth is that rebellions were spontaneous explosions of rage. In truth, they were painstakingly planned. The Zanj rebellion simmered for years in Mesopotamia's salt marshes, with leaders like Ali ibn Muhammad quietly building alliances among enslaved Africans and local tribes before striking. The Peasants' Revolt in medieval England didn't erupt overnight. It fermented in taverns and fields, fueled by decades of unfair taxes and whispered grievances. Oppressors love to paint rebels as irrational mobs because it's easier to dismiss them. But history shows us the opposite. The most effective rebellions were coldly calculated, their leaders as much strategists as warriors. So why does this matter? Because sanitizing these struggles robs them of their power. When we strip ancient rebellions of their messiness, their betrayals, their compromises, their sheer improbability, we turn them into fairy tales. And fairy tales don't teach us how to resist, they just entertain. The real lesson: resistance is ugly, uneven, and often unrewarded. But every so often, against all odds, it bends the arc of history. Not because the rebels were perfect, but because they were human. And humanity, with all its flaws, is the one force no empire can ever fully control. The earth holds memories too brutal for parchment. When ancient rebels rose, their defiance wasn't just written, it was scorched into the land itself. Take the layer of ash beneath modern London, where Boudica's firestorm left a charcoal scar dating to 61 AD. Archaeologists sifting through that blackened soil found melted jewelry, warped iron nails, and the skeletal remains of families who never escaped the flames. These aren't just relics, they're snapshots of a queen's fury, preserved like a paused breath beneath the city's bustling streets. But fire wasn't the only rebel signature. In the Judean desert, the ruins of Masada whisper a darker story. Roman siege camps still encircle the mountain fortress like stone teeth, their outlines visible from space. Inside, archaeologists found arrowheads clustered near defensive walls, pottery shards marked with rebel names, and 11 small lots, each holding bone fragments. These likely belonged to the last holdouts who chose death over Roman chains, their final act of defiance etched into the very dust. Some of the most telling evidence comes not from destruction, but from creation. The Sicilian slave wars left behind rebel coins stamped with the Greek word eleutharia, freedom. Struck in Enaz-captured mint, these crude coins flipped the script, transforming symbols of economic control into emblems of liberation. Similarly, in England, metal detectors recently uncovered a peasant's lead badge from the 1381 revolt, depicting a straw hat Wat Tyler's symbol pierced by a sword. It wasn't state propaganda, it was grassroots memorabilia, proof that rebellion had its own iconography. Then there are the silent witnesses, mass graves. Near York, a pit held dozens of skeletons with bound wrists and execution wounds, likely Vikings slaughtered after failed uprisings against Anglo-Saxon rulers. In the Andes, Inca-era tombs reveal rebels buried face down, a deliberate insult meant to trap their spirits. These aren't just bones, they're political statements carved into flesh and bone. Perhaps the most haunting finds are the everyday objects repurposed for revolt. In a Thracian village, archaeologists unearthed farming tools reforged into spearheads. In the ruins of a Roman villa, a slave's iron collar was found pried open, the lock mechanism shattered from the inside. These artifacts don't just confirm written accounts, they humanize them. That collar wasn't just a restraint, it was a life someone broke free from, leaving behind the metallic scream of their escape. What makes these discoveries so vital is their stubborn honesty. Chronicles written by victors often twist the truth, but a child's shoe preserved in volcanic ash at Pompeii, or a rebel's knife hidden beneath a temple floor, tell no lies. They remind us that history isn't just about kings and treaties. It's about the cook who stirred poison into a tyrant's wine, the weaver who stitched secret messages into tapestries, the countless unnamed who left their defiance buried in the dirt, waiting centuries to be heard. The ground, it turns out, keeps better records than the archives, and sometimes all it takes is a trowel scrape to let the past scream. The line between criminal and crusader has always been drawn by the victors until you listen to the voices history tried to silence. Cicero, Rome's golden-tongued orator, branded rebels as enemies of order, arguing that even tyranny was preferable to chaos. Yet in the same breath, he praised Brutus for slaying Caesar, exposing the hypocrisy at the heart of the debate. Rebellion is only treason when it fails. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Athens, Stoic philosophers whispered a different truth, that suffering injustice without resistance was its own moral failing. Their question cuts deeper. If oppression is violence, isn't submission complicity? The ancients grappled with this tension through stories. The Hebrew Bible's tale of the Exodus framed resistance as divine mandate, with Moses defying Pharaoh under God's orders. Greek tragedies like Antigone turned rebellion into sacred duty, as the titular heroine buried her brother against the king's decree, declaring, "I was born to love, not to hate." These weren't just myths, they were ethical battlegrounds, testing where loyalty to authority ends and loyalty to conscience begins. Even Confucius, who preached harmony, acknowledged the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers who abused power could justly be overthrown. But theory collides with reality in the blood-stained dirt of history. When Rome crushed the Third Servile War, was Spartacus a criminal or a freedom fighter? The answer depends on where you stand. To the enslaved, his rebellion was a roar of humanity. To the Roman elite, it was a threat to civilization itself. This duality persists today. Modern legal systems still struggle to classify rebels, labeling them as terrorists or liberators based on who holds the gavel. The Nuremberg trials after World War II codified a radical idea that obedience to unjust laws could itself be a crime. Suddenly, the world acknowledged what ancient rebels knew instinctively, that morality doesn't always wear a badge. Yet even just causes risk corruption. The Maccabees began as defenders of religious freedom, but later imposed their own orthodoxies, executing Jews who embraced Greek culture. The Jacquerie peasants sought justice but slaughtered noble children alongside their oppressors. These messy truths force us to ask, does fighting monsters require becoming them? Or is some collateral damage inevitable when dismantling systems built on bones? Perhaps the most unsettling lesson from antiquity is that rebellion's morality often hinges on success. Had Boudica's revolt toppled Rome, she'd be immortalized as a liberator. Instead, her story survives as a cautionary tale. The Zanj rebellion's 14-year insurgency is celebrated today, but contemporary Arab chroniclers dismissed them as rabble. History, it seems, is written not by the righteous but by the survivors. So where does this leave us with a paradox? Rebellion is both sacred and sinful, noble and monstrous, depending on the eye of the beholder. The only consensus across time is that when the scales of injustice grow too heavy, someone will rise to tip them regardless of the cost. And maybe that's the point. Ethics, like resistance, isn't about clean answers. It's about asking the right questions, even when they have no easy reply. Because the moment we stop questioning is the moment we stop being human. Rebellion has always had its own visual language, a secret code painted on walls and etched into everyday objects. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered a fresco of Spartacus, not as the feared enemy of Rome, but as a hero, his image tucked discreetly in a tavern where the working class gathered. This wasn't just decoration, it was dissent in pigment, a silent nod to the gladiator who dared to challenge the empire. Even pottery told stories. Greek artisans under Roman rule slipped scenes of Prometheus stealing fire into banquet dishes, turning dinnerware into subversive propaganda. Every sip of wine from those cups was a toast to defiance. Symbols carried even greater power. The broken chain, carved into temple walls or woven into textiles, became an ancient meme of liberation. In Egypt, enslaved laborers building pharaohs' tombs left tiny, deliberate flaws in hieroglyphs, a crooked line in the symbol for eternity, a chisel mark through the word obedience. These weren't mistakes, they were sabotage in stone, proof that even the most controlled hands could leave fingerprints of resistance. The Vikings had their own twist, rune stones praising outlaws who defied kings, their inscriptions daring the reader to choose honor over loyalty. But art didn't just reflect rebellion, it fueled it. During the Nika riots in Constantinople, protesters used theater masks to anonymize themselves while chanting insults against Emperor Justinian. Centuries later, Andean weavers hid maps of rebel hideouts in their tapestries, their geometric patterns doubling as escape routes. Even colors became weapons. The purple dye reserved for Roman emperors, Tyrian rebels secretly sold it to their enemies, undermining the empire's monopoly on power with every illicit stitch. The most enduring rebel art, though, thrived in ambiguity. Celtic bards composed songs praising leaders who resisted Rome, lyrics so layered with double meanings that authorities couldn't prove sedition. Japanese kabuki theaters staged plays about legendary bandits, their actors winking at audiences as censors scowled in the back. This dance between creator and censor became its own art form, a game of cat and mouse where the mouse left clues for those who knew how to look. What makes these artistic acts so potent is their refusal to be erased. A sword can be melted, a leader executed, but a symbol scratched into clay or hummed in a tavern. It lingers. The Taino people of the Caribbean, facing annihilation under Spanish rule, carved their Zemi spirits into caves, hidden galleries of resilience that outlasted their creators. Today, their descendants still find those carvings, threads of identity stretching across centuries, because rebellion isn't just about overthrowing tyrants. It's about insisting, in every medium imaginable, that some voices refuse to be silenced. And sometimes all it takes is a brushstroke, a chisel mark, or a song sung just loudly enough to remind the powerful. Art doesn't just imitate life. It changes it. Ancient rebels didn't just shape history, they hijacked our imaginations, leaping from dusty scrolls into blockbuster films, best-selling novels, and even pixelated battlefields. Take Spartacus, the gladiator whose name alone conjures images of Kirk Douglas's defiant cry in the 1960 film, or the blood-soaked stars series that turned his rebellion into a primal scream against oppression. But here's the twist: Hollywood didn't invent his legend. It tapped into something older, a story so raw and universal that every retelling, whether as a Soviet ballet or a video game boss fight, feels like scratching an ancient itch. Because Spartacus isn't just a man, he's a metaphor. The underdog who stares down the empire, the slave who becomes a symbol, the loser who somehow wins by refusing to lose. That's why his name still sells tickets 2,000 years later. Boudica's had her own makeover, morphing from Tacitus's fiery queen into a feminist icon in novels like Dreaming the Eagle, or a warrior goddess in strategy games like Total War. Her chariot, blades fixed to the wheels, races through comic books and heavy metal lyrics, each version amplifying her rage against the machine of empire. But what's fascinating isn't just her popularity, it's how she's been reshaped to fit modern battles. In one generation, she's a Brexit allegory, in another, a Me Too avenger. That's the power of rebellion myths, their clay, endlessly remolded to mirror whatever injustice burns brightest now. Then there's the assassins, not the historical killers, but the hooded heroes of Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed. The game's lore spins their shadow war into a timeless battle for free will, blending real history with sci-fi flair. Players don't just control an assassin, they become the heir to a bloodline stretching back to the Hashishin, leaping across Renaissance Florence or Ptolemaic Egypt. It's a masterclass in rebellion's appeal, the fantasy of striking back against systems too big to fight head-on. And it works because the game's creators grasped a truth ancient rebels knew, that the best resistance stories aren't about strength but cunning. But pop culture's love affair with rebellion isn't just escapism, it's a feedback loop. When Netflix's Barbarians reimagines Arminius's ambush in the Teutoburg forest, or when The Hunger Games borrows Spartacus's imagery for its dystopian gladiators, they're not just borrowing cool visuals. They're resurrecting an old dialogue about power and resistance, one that started with actual people whispering plans in the dark. The irony, many of these rebels died forgotten until artists and gamers dug them up, polished off the blood, and handed them back to us as mirrors. So why do these ancient firebrands still command our screens and controllers? Because their struggles aren't relics, they're roadmaps. In a world where power still consolidates, where voices still get silenced, their stories are pressure valves. Playing as Cassandra in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or rooting for Boudica in a TV show lets us rehearse defiance, to taste the adrenaline of pushing back without the stakes. But sometimes, just sometimes, it goes further. The Arab Spring protesters who chanted, "Spartacus is here," weren't just quoting a movie, they were threading themselves into his story, proving that the line between ancient revolt and modern resistance isn't just blurred. It's imaginary. The real legacy of these rebels isn't in their victories or defeats, it's in their refusal to stay buried. Every time a game developer models a protagonist after a Thracian gladiator, or a novelist gives Boudica a new sword, they're doing what the rebels themselves once did, fighting for the most subversive idea of all, that the past isn't dead. It's waiting. The echoes of ancient resistance aren't trapped in the past, they pulse through every protest chant, every raised fist, every quiet act of defiance in the face of modern injustice. These rebels enslaved gladiators, starving peasants, outnumbered warriors, never knew their names would outlive empires. Yet here we are, centuries later, tracing their footsteps in the dust. What makes their stories timeless isn't just the drama of battle or the thrill of uprising, it's the raw, unshakable truth they reveal. That power always underestimates those it tries to crush. Think about the last time you saw a crowd march for justice, their voices rising like a storm. That's not new, it's ancient. Spartacus's army sang their own anthems as they marched toward Rome. The peasants of 1381 England carried banners painted with the same righteous fury as today's protest signs. Even the tools of resistance mirror each other across millennia. The coded quilts of the Underground Railroad, their kin to the knotwork messages Celtic rebels wove into their cloaks, the encrypted apps used by modern dissidents. Just a digital evolution of the Assyrian spies who whispered secrets through clay pipes in palace walls. The methods evolve, but the heartbeat remains: we are here. We refuse to disappear, but here's the quiet revolution no one talks about: how these stories reshape us. When a teenager reads about Boudica standing tall against Rome's legions, or a factory worker learns how the Zanj rebellion turned swamps into fortresses, something shifts. History stops being a graveyard and becomes a toolbox. Those long-dead rebels hand us their most potent weapon, the knowledge that no system is unbreakable. The Mapuch didn't just resist the Spanish Empire for 300 years, they handed future generations a blueprint for endurance. The assassins didn't just kill tyrants, they taught us that fear can be a two-way street. So as you scroll through news of modern struggles, the climate activists chaining themselves to pipelines, the whistleblowers leaking truths, the ordinary people organizing in basements and online forums, remember, you're not just witnessing history. You're continuing it. Every time someone chooses courage over compliance, they're adding another verse to an anthem as old as civilization itself. And that's why these ancient rebels still matter. Not because they won every battle, but because they proved the fight itself is sacred. Now it's your turn. Whose story lingers in your mind? The gladiator who defied an empire, the peasant queen who burned a city, or the unnamed thousands who resisted in ways too small for history books? Drop your thoughts below. Let's keep their legacies alive. And if you're hungry for more hidden histories of defiance, hit subscribe. The past isn't finished speaking. And